All right, here we go.
We'll get started. Good morning, everybody. We'll get started in about 1 minute. Okay, we'll begin. Okay, so good morning, everybody, and welcome to Janover's continuing webinars on dealing with taking advantage of some of the tax opportunities on COVID-19. One big issue that's been facing um, the times right now is many people are spending a lot of time, or pretty much practically all of the time, outside New York City. They live in New York City, their businesses are in New York City, and since the middle of March, they've been spending a lot of time in the Hamptons, Connecticut, Florida, Westchester, or outside the city. And they're looking at this point in time as to what they should be doing to avoid any New York City, New York State income taxes and so forth. My name is Barry Sunshine. I'm the moderator. I'm a senior tax partner at the firm. And we're going to be joined with Richard Feldman. He's a senior tax manager in the firm. And today's agenda that we'll be covering is who is subject to New York State and city taxes, and how to best structure your personal and business life to avoid New York City and state taxes if you can take advantage of it. And what are the effects of telecommuting to your company and to your business, and what strategies you can take advantage of to avoid New York City and state taxes. So it's going to be a very good agenda. It's very timely and it's very valued. And we also have on the bottom of your screen, there should be Q&A. So if you have any questions, we'll monitor the questions and answers throughout the program, and we will try to address them as they come up. I think without further ado, Richard, why don't you continue and start?
All right. Thank you so much, Barry. And good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for all of you who are joining us today. As Barry mentioned, hoping this will be an informative and useful presentation for everyone who's joining us today. As I'm sure most of you have heard, that as a result of the pandemic, state and local governments are basically broke. They're projecting tremendous revenue shortfalls. New York State is hoping the federal government's going to bail them out. The city is hoping the state will jump in and bail them out. Nobody knows for sure how this is going to end. However, I can tell you there are two things that we can most likely expect will result and which we will see coming up. First of all, there are going to be proposals for new taxes and higher taxes. You can be pretty certain of that. And second of all, there will certainly be increased scrutiny of taxpayers and of anyone who's looking to avoid paying taxes. When it comes to generating revenue, it's usually easier for the state to audit taxpayers than to necessarily raise taxes or enforce new or to make new taxes. A couple of weeks ago, Governor Cuomo, in one of his daily press conferences, was asked about possibly expanding the New York State millionaires tax. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, the millionaire's tax was enacted in 2009. It was supposed to be a temporary tax. And here, 11 years later, it's still going on with a top rate of 8.82 for New York State, 3.88 for New York City, which is a combined rate of 12.7%. Governor Cuomo was actually asked a few weeks ago about the possibility of expanding expanding the millionaire's tax. And I'm just going to play a brief excerpt from his response.
Our population, 1% of the population pays 50% of the taxes. And they're the most mobile people on the globe. I literally talk to people all day long who are now in their Hamptons house, who also lived here, or in their Hudson Valley house, or in their Connecticut weekend house. And I say, you got to come back. When are you coming back? We'll go to dinner. I'll buy you a drink. Come over, I'll cook. They're not coming back right now. And you know what else they're thinking? If I stay there, they pay a lower income tax because they don't pay the New York City surcharge. So that would be a bad place if we had to go there.
Well, thank you, Governor Cuomo, for joining us this morning. That was Governor Cuomo from August 5th talking about the possibility of expanding the millionaire's tax in New York. As the governor mentioned, many people have left New York and they're not coming back so quickly. Initially, they left back in March because of the coronavirus and their businesses being shut down. Over the last few months, many have realized that they may not need to go back to the city, and many don't even want to go back. People have realized that with technology that they have, whether they're business owners or employees, they can be just as productive working at home in a remote location. There's no longer to be within a short commute of their New York City offices. Additionally, New York City is not the place it was a year ago. Many of the attractions that made New York City so desirable are no longer accessible. I'm talking about the restaurants, the theaters, the museums, and of course, Barry, Yankee Stadium. Without these attractions, people haven't been in such a hurry to return to the city. Additionally, as has been reported in the press, crime is on the rise. Murder has seen an upswing. There are homeless people sleeping on the streets. It's at the point where people who did stay in the city for the duration are now leaving or thinking of leaving because of the conditions, because of the current conditions in New York City. But as the governor mentioned, there's another factor that people are thinking about. Whether they left the city or they may be leaving the city, they're now thinking about the tax ramifications. The governor made it sound really simple, but I'm sure he knows, and you can be certain that the people who work for him, the people whose job it is to make sure of it, are making sure they all know that it's not so easy to just stop paying taxes in New York. So today's agenda, we're going to talk about who is subject to New York State and New York City tax. We're going to talk about what can be done to avoid being taxed as a resident, and what impact does working from a temporary location have on New York State and New York City residency. We're also going to talk about telecommuting issues for employees, employers, and self-employed individuals as well. I just want to mention that we're going to be speaking today primarily about New York State and New York City tax issues, but you should be aware that other states have similar rules for residency purposes. Also, today's discussion is really general in nature. If you have specific circumstances, specific situations that should be addressed, you should try to discuss them with your Janover tax professional. So let's get started. Who is subject to New York State and New York City tax? Well, first of all, residents of New York State and New York City are taxed on all their income by both the state and the city. I've heard it stated before that New York taxes one thing and one thing only. What is that one thing? Everything. That's right. If you're a resident of New York or New York City, you're going to be taxed on all of your income, no matter where you earn it, no matter what state it's earned in. So now that doesn't mean that you're not going to get a credit for it. If you have income earned in another state, New York provides what's known as the resident credit for tax paid on income taxed by other states. Now, of course, if that income is earned in a state where there is no tax, and just a quick trivia question here, there are 7 states in the United States that don't have any income tax at all. And that would be Alaska, Texas, Florida, Nevada, South Dakota, and New York. So those states don't have any income tax, so there wouldn't be any resident credit. So if you're a New York resident, you're going to pay tax on that income to New York State. Now, non-residents of New York, they get taxed on just their New York sourced income. There are different ways of allocating income to New York. We're not going to get into the details of that today. It's beyond the scope of our presentation, but just you should be aware that non-residents get taxed on all their New York sourced income. And a New York City resident, it's all or nothing. If you're a New York City resident, you get taxed on all your income. But if you're not a New York City resident, then no matter how much income is sourced to New York, as a non-resident, you're not going to pay tax on it because there is no longer a New York City non-resident tax. There was one years ago, before my time, but it's no longer in play. So only New York City residents are subject to the 3.876% New York City resident tax. So obviously that tax can be somewhat significant, depending on how much money you make, obviously. So someone who has not been in the city for some time or doesn't believe that they're a New York City resident is obviously going to want to avoid paying that significant New York City tax. So what can they do to avoid that New York City tax? But first of all, let's talk about who is subject to the New York City tax and the New York State tax for that matter as well. Just want to point out that for New York State and New York City purposes, basically for residency purposes, the same rules and regulations apply, which determine whether a person is a New York City resident would be the same rules to determine whether someone is a New York State resident. It's really interchangeable. You can be a New York State resident, obviously, not be a New York City resident, but that can sometimes be up for dispute as well. So there are basically 2 residency tests, which would determine whether someone is subject to the New York City residency test or the New York State residency tax, I should say. So there's domicile and statutory residence. So domicile basically means the place where an individual makes his permanent home. There's a saying that home is where the heart is. And that's basically what we're talking about. Where is the focus of your life? For most people, for lots of people, it's very obvious where their home is. If you ask someone where do they live, they'll say they live in New York, they live in Florida, they live in Georgia, wherever the case may be. It's going to be somewhat obvious. But for other people, it may not be so obvious. People who have more than one residence, it may not be so obvious, and there may be a position for them to take that their home is someplace else. I should point out, though, that for domicile purposes, it has to be a permanent home. It can't be a temporary living quarters. That's what it says clearly in the regulations, that it has to be a permanent home where a person intends to make their permanent home. So it can't be something temporary. I'm going to use it as an example for those baseball fans out there who are following this year's what you'd call the baseball season. So there's one team, the Toronto Blue Jays, who are playing at a temporary location, but I don't think anyone's going to say that their home is Buffalo. Their home is Toronto, but they're temporarily in Buffalo, but Toronto is their home. So if we were talking about for tax purposes, Toronto would be their domicile, because that's where they come from, that's where their heart is. And that's where they intend to return when the temporary conditions that require them to be in a temporary location end. So domicile is the first test and the primary test for residency. The second test is, which we're not going to talk about all that much today, but it's something to be aware of, and that's a statutory residency. So a statutory resident is someone who is not domiciled in New York. New York is not his permanent place where he wants to be, but he maintains a permanent place of abode there. And in addition to that, he spends more than 183 days there. So someone who fulfills those two conditions, a permanent place of abode and 183 days, is considered a statutory resident for New York State purposes. An example of that is that we deal with pretty frequently is someone who works in the city, has an office in the city, and decides to take out an apartment there, a pied-à-terre, as they say, which is not necessarily his permanent place, but it's a permanent place of abode located in the city. And by being there, if he's also in the city for 183 days, he will be deemed to be a statutory resident. And that's, you also have that someone may have a place in the Hamptons, but may have their primary home in New Jersey or Connecticut or another state. Again, they would be a statutory resident if they meet the 183-day threshold.
Yeah, Richard, those are good points. And one of the couple of things is it's an either or. To be a resident of New York, you either have to be domiciled or a statutory resident. And a lot of people don't understand the statutory resident rule. Like, for example, if there's a New Jersey resident who's domiciled in New Jersey, works in New York City, if they have I'll call it a vacation home, upstate New York, even though they didn't only maybe spend 10 days upstate New York, but they actually work in New York City and they went into New York City every single day. So they spend 183 days in New York City going to work, but they only have their vacation home up in New York State. Because they have a permanent place of abode located in New York and they spend 183 days there, they would be considered a statutory resident. So it's important to note that just because you have an apartment in New York City or upstate and you don't use it, you still can be considered a resident of that state. So you got to be careful in looking at this.
Right. That's an excellent point, Barry. And one other thing I want to add is that for the statutory residency test, a part of a day counts as a full day. There are limited exceptions for travel and medical issues, but generally a part of a day, if you're in New York for even part of a day, that's going to count as a full day. There's no, people who are familiar with the Paycheck Protection Program may be familiar with the concept of full-time equivalency. There's no full-time equivalency here. A part of a day in New York is considered a full day. So that's just something to watch out for if you possibly are subject to the statutory residency rule. There are two other tests which I just want to mention briefly. For a person who's domiciled in New York but doesn't have a permanent resident in New York, there are two other tests to avoid being taxed as a resident. And that's the 548-day test and the 30-day test. 548 days, that's basically 18 months. If out of those 18 months you spend 450 days in a foreign country and not more than 90 in New York, and of course you don't have a permanent place of abode, you also would not be subject to the residency tax. And the 30-day test is similar for someone with no permanent place of abode and spends no more than 30 days in New York. So when we talk about domicile, we said that intention is very important. So a domicile, once it's established, it's established until you change it. And you can't just change it by accident, or you have to actually have a intention to change your domicile and to make a different place your domicile. And there's an important rule here that you need to actually leave one domicile, you have to leave New York, and you have to land someplace else. And you have to stick that landing. We call that the takeoff and landing rule. Because a person may think that, okay, I'm leaving New York and I'm gonna go cruise around the world. And eventually I'll find a place where I want to stay, maybe Florida, California, Arizona, wherever the case may be. When that person leaves New York, he's still a New York State resident or a New York City resident until he actually establishes a domicile in that new place. And again, I said, in order to establish to change your domicile, it has to be intentional. And you need to actually show that attention. If you just are lying in bed at night and say, you know, I don't want to be a New York resident anymore, I want to be a Florida resident, that's not going to be sufficient. Yes, that is the intention, but you have to be able to show that intention. As they say, actions speak louder than words. So you want to document that intention. You want to put it in writing, if you can, that you want to change your residency, but you also have to walk the walk and talk the talk, as they say. You need to put those actions, make them do something concrete to show that you're changing your residency. So how do you go about doing that? So there are certain factors that we have, and these are the factors that will be considered. So there's the home factor, the location factor, time, near and dear items, and family. So home obviously is a very important factor. Someone who just gets up and sells their house in New York and purchases a new home in another location, another state, that's going to be pretty obvious that they're changing their domicile. But again, as I said earlier, it's not always that simple. It's not going to be easy if you have multiple residents to necessarily say that one is your home and one is not. So if you're audited, the auditors are going to look to see, okay, where is your larger home? Where is your more valuable home? Which home do you own? Which home do you rent? And of course, when we're talking about these factors, not one factor is going to be determinative. Every factor is going to be looked at, and every factor is going to be subjective. So just talking about the home factor, obviously you could have a multi-million-dollar home in New York, which is going to be a lot smaller, even though it's a lot more expensive than your much larger house in Florida. But that doesn't necessarily mean that your much more valuable home in New York is your residence, and it doesn't mean is where your domicile is, and it doesn't mean that your much larger house in Florida is going to be your domicile. Again, you have to look at all the factors and all the facts and circumstances. Another factor that's very important is your location of your business. So if you want to say, well, a Florida resident, that's going to be difficult to say that if your business is based in New York and you're still very heavily involved in that business, you're running that business, you're coming back and forth very frequently to New York to run that business. That's another factor that's going to be considered. And of course, one of the most important factors is where do you spend your time, which is not to be confused with the statutory residency test, but the way you spend your time is going to play a tremendous role in where you're going to say you're domiciled. It's going to be difficult to say that you're domiciled in Florida when you only spend 60, 70 days a year there. And you may not spend 300 days in New York. You may be traveling a lot. You may go to, travel all over the world. But the place where you're domiciled, they're going to look at how much time you spend there versus how much time you spend other places. And that's going to be a very important factor if you're being audited, of course. Another factor that's looked at is where are your near and dear items? Where are your pictures, your wedding albums, your family heirlooms? Where do you keep those things? Because it makes sense to think that a person who wants to be domiciled in a particular place where he intends to be domiciled, that's going to be where he keeps his items that are near and dear to him. And probably the most important factor is going to be family. And I'm talking about your spouse and your minor children and where those children go to school. If someone was a New York City resident and because of the pandemic may have moved out to the Hamptons, but their children are still zooming into school in New York City, it's going to be a tough argument to say that you really had intention to leave New York City.
Now, Richard,
yes.
It's interesting. So what you're saying is this. You're saying that there's a lot of different factors and each taxpayer has their own situation and their own fact pattern.
Absolutely.
So there's no one fact pattern, or there's no one situation that will say that you're resident or non-resident. You have to take a look at all the factors in there. But it's clear that if you have a domicile in New York City, and since, let's say, mid-March, you moved out in New York City, you rented a place in Connecticut, New Jersey, and or the Hamptons, out Long Island, or even Florida. If everything remains the same, meaning all your mail comes to your house in New York City, your business is doing business in New York City, except maybe you're telecommuting a little bit more. The time spent is all outside New York City for the balance of this year. Near and dear items, all your rich artwork and your family heirlooms are in New York City, still there. And if your young children are zooming into the New York City school system, are you saying that you may be a New York City resident?
That's correct. In order to change your domicile, you look at all these factors, but you also need I'd say a drastic change in lifestyle, which shows that intention to change domicile. So obviously it's going to be easy if you sell that New York City apartment, or you sublease it. You tell your landlord you don't want to renew that apartment anymore. Those are concrete steps that you're taking to show that you're permanently moving to the Hamptons or to another location. But if all those factors that you mentioned, nothing really changes other than that you temporarily, and temporary can be a month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, but you're temporarily residing in that vacation home, you're still most likely going to be considered a New York City resident. It's important, though, that you get as many of the factors on your side as you possibly can, because all these factors get weighed. And it's hard to say that one factor is necessarily stronger than the other. Like I said, it's very subjective. And if you're ever involved in an audit, all these factors are going to be looked at and analyzed, and a determination will be made. And in order to make that determination, it could be appealed. And you want to make your argument as strong as you possibly can by looking at these factors and saying, okay, well, how do I weigh this factor in my favor? That's what you need to do. Now, there are other factors which sometimes get considered when someone's changing a domicile, and that orders will look at, but they're not really going to be that important. They may be like tiebreaker factors, you know, addresses on your bills and on your statements, you know, where you get your mail and things like that, where your driver's license is, where your voter registration is, things like that. Those are not really very important factors when it comes to establishing where your domicile is. And then there are other factors which probably aren't even considered at all. Where a person had their burial plot, people used to think that was an important factor, but that's not something that's even looked at all. And you know, where your will is probated, these items are really not very important. So Barry, you started to mention different scenarios. You want to bring that up again? And how a person can be avoiding their New York City tax.
Yeah, I think, yeah. So if you have a Wall Street person who lives in New York City in a nice condo, they moved out to the Hamptons in mid-March. They plan to stay for the duration of the pandemic. You know, they are still voting in New York City. The license is still in New York City. The bank account's still in New York City. They feel that this is, they're going to be in the Hamptons for as long as this pandemic continues, which nobody knows the answer. And what brought them to New York City is Wall Street. Now, the next question is what do they need to do to make them, to avoid the New York City tax?
Right. So all those factors that you just mentioned, the one thing that rings out is you said that they're staying there until the pandemic is over. So that by its very nature means that it's temporary, or at least we're hoping that it's temporary. But they want to make it permanent. And if they're deciding, so first of all, when did they decide to make it permanent? Was it back in March? Were they thinking that, you know, it's nice out here, I can do everything that I need to do. I'm going to make this my permanent location, and my New York City residence is going to be temporary. So there are those factors that we mentioned. Try to document it. If you can, you know, put your New York City residence up for sale and maybe make your Hamptons home, you know, renovate that or buy a bigger one. Do concrete steps to make it look like you actually intend to make that a permanent situation. Register the kids in school. But one thing you need to really keep in mind is if you change your residence and you're going to report that on your 2020 tax return, 2020 hindsight is going to be very important, because when you report on your 2020 tax return that you changed your residency and you're no longer a New York City resident, or no longer a New York State resident for that matter, when is that going to be audited? It's probably not going to be audited until maybe 2022, 2023. And at that point, the auditor is going to say, the first question is going to be, okay, well, you changed your residency in 2020, and that was supposed to be permanent, right? Okay, well, where do you live now? And Barry, if you're going to say, well, the pandemic ended, please God, in 2020, so I moved back to my residence in New York City in January, the auditor is going to say, well, sorry, you never intended to permanently move to the Hamptons, to move to Long Island, to move out of New York City. It was only temporary. And the very fact that you're now back and living in Manhattan and living the Manhattan life, going to your office downtown, going to the theater and your restaurants and doing everything that a New York City resident does, it's really going to be a very tough argument. It's going to be a very uphill battle with that auditor to claim that in 2020 you were a non-resident of New York City. If, on the other hand, though, in 2023, when you get that audit letter in the mail, it comes to your residence in the Hamptons, which you are spending all your time at, and you fully established yourself as a resident in the Hamptons, and your kids are going to school in the Hamptons, and you really never left. You may go into the city occasionally for business reasons, but you never really left. I think you will have a much stronger argument in that situation. So 2020 hindsight is going to be very important, as well as all the other factors, to the extent that you can weigh those factors in your favor.
Richards, so I was under the impression, and correct me if I'm wrong, the residency and the domicile issue is a year-by-year test, okay? While I say that with quotes on it because the domicile, you just can't change domicile from New York to California to Colorado each year, because if you intend to return back to New York for a 5-year trend, maybe 2 years later, you may be, New York State may take the position, New York City may take the position that you never gave up the domicile. So right. Some of these things that are near and dear to you have to get evaluated. One person asked the question, how important is it to this domicile and residency issue if your children are in private school in New York City? Do you have to then, let's say if you want the rest of this year to be a non-resident or non-domiciled in New York City, do you have to take your kids out of school or have to attend maybe a private school in Long Island or Connecticut, California, Colorado? What do you think about that?
Well, I think like everything else, it's a factor that comes into the whole determination. If your kids are registered in school in the city, it shows an intention it may show an intention to still be a New York City resident. And if you want to change the way that factor is going to be looked at, then obviously if you register them in a school outside of the city, that shows a stronger intention to be a non-resident of New York City. There's no, again, as we mentioned, there's no bright line test here. It's all going to be looked at, all the factors in such a situation are going to be looked at and see where you end up. You want to do whatever you can to make the argument as strong as it possibly can be. So leaving your kids registered in a school in the city, even if they're Zooming into their classes, may be a factor that's weighed against you. I can't tell you exactly how New York City or New York State, which is the jurisdiction that actually does the audit. I can't tell you exactly how they're going to weigh these issues, but one thing that I can say with pretty strong certainty is that New York City or New York State is going to be pretty aggressive in their audits. If someone who's always filed as a New York City resident all of a sudden starts filing as a non-resident, I think we can agree that New York City is going to look at that pretty closely, or rather New York State is going to look at that pretty closely and want to make sure before they agree that you're a non-resident, they're going to argue it pretty strongly. I think that's something that we can certainly be sure of.
Now, Richard, remember, I guess if you're domiciled, right, you don't have the 183-day test, right?
That's
but
correct.
If you're a statutory resident where your domiciled is outside New York City, right, mm-hmm. and you go into New York City and you have an apartment in New York City, if you spend time in New York City, 183 days or more, and you have a second place of abode located in the city, then you'd be a resident. So the statutory test is a year-by-year test, whereas a domicile test, it's like, I don't know if it's like it's not a one-year test, but to change a domicile is, I'll call it a lifestyle movement or lifestyle.
Absolutely, absolutely. Domicile is going to be harder to change back and forth. I'm not saying it's impossible. It can be done. Obviously, if someone, sells their residence in New York, buys a new residence in Florida, let's say, I think where it's pretty clear circumstances, they no longer have a residence in New York, that's a change of domicile pretty clearly. If next year they decide, well, we don't like living in Florida and they would go back to New York, I think that's a pretty clear change in domicile the other way. And, maybe the following year they say, well, I don't like New York anymore. I want to go try another state. I think in theory, you can change your domicile, every year, but practically speaking, it's not done. Whereas statutory residency, that's a year-by-year test. You're going to look, if you have a permanent place of abode, they look at the days. If you pass the days test, more than 183 days, you're a statutory resident. If you don't, you're not a statutory resident. Which brings us to the next scenario, which is pretty similar to the person who is temporarily in the Hamptons or moved to the Hamptons. What if someone moved to Connecticut? All the factors are going to be pretty much the same, but the added kicker here is that now you've got Connecticut issues to deal with, because now you've moved to your Connecticut vacation home and you're spending more than half a year there. So first of all, maybe you're now a statutory resident of Connecticut, as well as being a domiciliary of New York. So you now have Connecticut tax issues to deal with. And Connecticut is going to say, well, you're now a Connecticut resident. We want our tax. And you're also working in Connecticut, even if you're not necessarily a statutory resident, they may say, well, you've been conducting your business in Connecticut. That income should be sourced to Connecticut. So that's another issue that you need to consider if you have a residence outside of New York State. If you have a vacation home outside of New York State, where you're going to be working from, that obviously needs to be considered as well. And another possible scenario is the snowbird scenario. Someone who's maybe been traveling back and forth from New York to Florida, Florida to New York every year. Maybe they stay in New York for the summers, and in October, November, they'll go to Florida for the winter. And generally they'll come back to New York, to their main home in the spring, in April. Well, maybe this year they didn't do that. Maybe this year they decided they're going to stay in their Boca Raton or their Palm Beach condo throughout the summer because they're afraid to travel. And we've gotten this question also. I'm in Florida. It's now August. I've been in Florida since last October. I think I should be a Florida resident. And not be subject to New York residency tax. So it's really going to be the same situation. And you're going to have to look at all the facts. What have I done to make Florida my permanent home? If I haven't really done anything and I'm only really staying or extending my stay on a temporary basis because of the pandemic, but once the pandemic is over, I'm going to go back to my normal cycle of October, November until March or April. But my main home, where all my family heirlooms are, and my bigger home is still in New York, and that's where the focus of my life is still in New York. It's really going to be hard pressed to say that I become a Florida resident. Okay, and I think now we'll move on to another topic, and that's telecommuting, which has obviously become a very, very big issue with lots of taxpayers. Telecommuting, for those of you who don't know, and I'm sure everyone is pretty much familiar with it, telecommuting is basically doing mobile work, remote work, working from home, basically working from a place which is not the central or your assigned work location, but you're using technology to work from that remote location. So the question is going to be, well, where are your wages going to be sourced? If you're a if you're an employee of a New York City business and you're working from your home in New Jersey or Connecticut, so where are those wages sourced? So New York State has this rule known as the convenience of the employer rule, which basically means that if an employee whose main work location or only work location is a New York City office, right? I'm an accountant and my firm is located in New York, but I have a residence in New Jersey, which since this pandemic started, I'm going to be working out of that New Jersey location or that Connecticut location. Where are my wages sourced? So New York says that if based on the convenience of the employer rule, those wages are going to be sourced to the New York location, to the location of the New York office. And New York doesn't care that the employee is no longer physically working in New York State or New York City. New York State says that since your primary work location, the location where you're assigned to work is in New York, we have the right to tax you. And that's known as the convenience of the employer rule. So the question is, how do other states treat that? So generally speaking, if the other state is going to treat the tax the same way and follows the convenience of the employer rule, then you're not going to be taxed in that state. So Connecticut now, they used to not follow the convenience of the employer rule, and they used to tax a Connecticut resident who was working in Connecticut and had an office in New York. There's the landmark United States Supreme Court case on this issue, the Zelensky case, where a person was deemed to work in Connecticut and work in New York because that's where his main business location was, and he was actually taxed on that income twice. But Connecticut has since changed that rule, and they now have the convenience of the employer rule as well. So there's somewhat reciprocity where if the state where your office is follows the convenience of the employer rule and the state where you're living follows the convenience of the employer rule, you won't be double taxed. But if you're in a situation where you're working out of a state, let's say Arizona, where there is no convenience of the employer rule, you can be subject to double taxation in such a situation. That's assuming the state where you're working is aware, and of course, we're all honest people, and if you're working in that state, you want to do what's right and report the income that you're required to report.
Richard, let me ask you something. This pandemic is challenging or enhancing or challenging this convenience of the employer rule. Mm-hmm. So if I was a president of a company and it was based in New York City, and through the mid-March, I was always working in New York City because my office is in New York City, but my office is closed. It's a non-essential business. Its office is closed, and I'm working at home in Connecticut now.
Right.
Is that I'm not doing it for the convenience of the employer because my office is closed. So what new considerations or factors that people should be evaluating as to whether that's considered New York income for the convenience of the employer or Connecticut income now?
Right. Well, I believe there are some states that have come out and said that they will follow they will follow the convenience of the employer rule, or they won't follow the convenience of the employer rule based on the pandemic. But New York State has come out with no guidance at all. So New York, if you're talking about New York State, they're still going to take the position, or my hunch is, they haven't come out with any guidance, so it's really hard to know for sure. But my hunch is that New York State will say, we don't care. Your primary work location is New York State, and the fact that you are working out of another location because that office is closed, it may not necessarily be convenience. The convenience of the employer rule basically means that you're working at another location out of the employee's convenience. So if it's at the employee's convenience, but not necessarily employer's convenience, it doesn't change anything. The convenience of the employer rule is still in place. However, if you're working at the other location out of convenience of the employer because the employer does not want you working in their New York location, there may be an argument to make that the convenience of the employer rule does not apply. We don't know for sure how New York State is going to treat that. New York State may say, well, we're not going to look at that as a convenience of the employer rule, but we don't know for sure.
I
But I understand what you're saying, that the fact that the office is closed, the taxpayer may want to make that argument that you're at a different location out of convenience for the employer.
You know, I think, Richard, what you're saying is this: New York City and state and all the states are wrestling with these issues, as well as tax advisors and taxpayers. It's clear. There's and the states haven't issued a lot of states haven't issued formal guidance on it. New York is one of them.
That's absolutely true. And I can tell you one thing: New York State has come out with, or I don't know if it was formal guidance, but Governor Cuomo was asked earlier during this pandemic if a healthcare worker, a visiting healthcare worker who came to New York, would they be subject to New York State taxing jurisdiction, because they came just to help out with the emergency that was going on. And I believe Governor Cuomo responded that New York State is in such dire straits that if you're working in New York, even if it's for help with the emergency, New York State is still going to tax them. Now, it's interesting to point out that back in, I think it was 2012, during Hurricane Sandy, when there were emergency responders that came into New York State at that point did come out with specific guidance saying that emergency responders who were coming to New York just to help with the emergency were not going to be subjected to New York State tax, because they were here for emergency reasons, on temporary reason, so they would not be subject to tax. But we have not heard that taxpayer-friendly guidance at all during this current pandemic. Another thing that I just want to point out, and we're running up against the clock here, but it also has to do with telecommuting issues, and these are the employer issues. So your general rule is that if an employer has an employee working in another state, that will give them physical presence in that state and give the employer nexus in that state. So if you're a employee of a New York business working from home in another state, such as New Jersey, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, whatever the case may be, and that New York employer never had nexus in those states before, the question is, does that employee now give the employer, by the fact that he's working in that state, does he give the employer nexus, meaning that the employer now has to file tax returns and pay tax in that state? So certain states, including New Jersey, have come out and said that nexus, they will not, the business will not be deemed to have nexus due to the fact that the employee is working at home in the home state due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Other states, such as New York, have not come out with any guidance and have not said that. So if you look at the other side of the coin, if you have employee in an out-of-state business working from home in New York. So if it's a New Jersey business, let's say, that has an employee working at their home in New York, and that employer, that business, never had nexus in New York before, does that business now have nexus in New York? Well, New York State has not issued guidance, but the inclination is that New York State is likely to say that the employer now has nexus in New York and is now going to be required to file tax returns in New York. And until New York State says otherwise, we as tax advisors would probably advise that New York State nexus is in play there, but we don't know absolutely for sure yet. One other issue before we wrap up is the UBT issue. So for UBT purposes, and for those of you who aren't familiar, UBT is the New York City unincorporated business tax, which is for self-employed individuals and partnerships doing business in New York. So that tax is sourced by where the actual services are being performed. So if you have a lawyer or an accountant providing their services, which are generally in New York City, so that would be subject to New York City UBT tax. However, if due to the current pandemic, all those services are being performed outside of New York City, there's a very strong case to be made that those that those services should no longer be subject to UBT tax, or rather they should be allocated or apportioned outside of New York City for the amount of wages or for the amount of services that are performed outside of New York City. And even if you take a firm, a law firm, where their employees are now working outside of the city, whereas previously they were 100% in the city, and the allocation would have been 100% to New York City, there's absolutely a position to take now if those employees are now working outside of the city, that those services can be apportioned accordingly, and your New York City apportionment factor for UBT purposes will be much lower, and accordingly there should be a much lower New York City tax.
Richard, let me ask you something. You know, all these things are great things that you're talking about, portioning in and out of New York City and facts. Do you have, I mean, what things should taxpayers do to document and support if they're going to take this position of being not a New York City resident? I mean, should they be keeping, what kind of diaries should they be keeping, calendar, log?
I think that's a key word. You want to document everything, all those factors that we discussed. You want to be able to document in real time how they were done, how you showed that you were no longer making New York City your home, whether it meant renting out your New York City residence, terminating your lease, whatever you were doing to put those factors in your favor, you want to document that, and so that it's clear. And don't forget, at a certain point, you're going to want to say, assuming you have a good set of facts, you're going to want to say when this change of residency took place. Did it take place in March? Did it take place in April, May, or June, or July or August? So you're gonna want to say as early as possible to decrease your New York City tax. So you need to document those time periods so that when you are up against an auditor, and the auditor is going to say, okay, you're not a resident, but that change in residency didn't take place until September. You want to be able to document when it took place so that you could change those facts as early as possible.
Yep.
And as far as employees, you'd want to document your days to the extent that you can, showing where you worked and when you worked at home versus when you were in the office, because if those facts are helpful, when it comes time to file your tax return, you want to have those documents handy and clearly documented that will be in your favor. And I think that's showing 10 o'clock.
I guess I have a couple questions here, Richard,
Okay, sure.
just a couple questions.
Absolutely.
I think that one question is, do you think New York State and New York City is going to enhance the number of audits in the next few years? Because I think some taxpayers may be aggressively applying these, trying to get out of New York State and city taxes. Do you think that's going to happen, or and what things should we prepare for?
Absolutely. I think I said that at the outset, that you can be certain that New York City, New York State is going to be scrutinizing these issues very carefully. Because don't forget, New York City is going to have no money. They're broke. So they're going to do whatever they can do to bring in revenue. And when they see that taxpayers are changing their residency, taking position that they're no longer subject to New York City tax or New York State tax, I think New York State is going to be expending whatever resources they can to make sure that those taxpayers are audited and looked at very carefully to make sure that they are legitimately non-residents. And New York City is going to be arguing tooth and nail, taking position that those taxpayers are residents and are subject to New York State tax.
So Richard, so basically, Richard, what you're saying is, you know, just don't, after the fact, after 2019, 20, whatever, however long this pandemic lasts, just don't do after the year-end tax planning to support your position. You should be talking with advisors now to best strategically plan, if you can get out of New York City, New York State, and how you plan your business to take advantage of it. Is that what you're really saying?
Absolutely. You want to be as proactive as possible. And right now we do have, you know, it would have been better if we spoke back in March. But now we still have the advantage. We have time on our side to a certain extent, depending on how long this is going to last. So you want to be proactive, and planning is always best than having to deal with 2020 hindsight. You want to be able to plan to the best extent possible to make sure we have the facts on our side or on your side.
Yep. There's another question here. If I sold my vacation home in 2020 and I'm planning on claiming as my primary resident for 2020 and 2019, would I be subject to pay taxes on the gain on the sale? Richard, you want to tackle that one?
Well, I assume you're talking about the federal tax purposes. If you're selling your vacation home, it's not your primary residence. So the primary residence exclusion for federal tax purposes would not apply if it's not your primary residence.
So what you're saying is
you wouldn't be subject to tax on that. Am I understanding the question correctly?
yeah, so I think the answer is yes, you are subject to tax on the gain. And if the property, and you pay taxes to the state to where the property is located. And if you're, let's say, if you're in New York.
Right, you're going to pay taxes to the state where you're a resident. So, which is always an issue. If you have a large gain in a year after you change your residency, that's also something that's going to be looked at and scrutinized very carefully, because if there's a large gain, which is a taxable gain, obviously your former state is going to look at that to make sure they're getting their fair share. Lots of times taxpayers try to change their residency right before they have a large taxable transaction to try to avoid that tax.
Mm-hmm.
That's what you want to look at as well.
Okay. Now so we're getting to that time where we have to end. Sorry it's very informative, Richard, and very good. Give you a lot of good food for thought to answer these questions. If you have any questions, you could always email Richard Feldman at the email address on the slide. The slides will be available. Just reach out to our marketing department and I'll make these slides available. I just want to thank everybody for their attendance, and thank you, Richard, and everybody for joining us and being so informative.
Yes, thank you, Barry, and thank you everyone who joined. Please feel free to reach out with any questions. Okay.